All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to Hot Springs Village. I see a lot of familiar faces here. I'm Pete Greenway. I really appreciate you coming out. I hope you enjoyed the little expo that we did. And you know, we're just blessed tonight to have Dr. Wallach. Thank you. So, just a couple of quick announcements. So we're going to run until about 8:10, 8:15. Then there'll be about a 20-minute intermission. There will be food still out there. There will be a bar is open, right? So if you do want to drink after you hear what Dr. Wallach says, you can get one. There will also be there's energy drinks out there. So we're just about ready to get started, and I'm going to turn it over to Ben. Oh, also there will be books for sale in the lobby, and after the presentation tonight, right after intermission, we got a very special segment. Ben Fuchs will interview Dr. Wallach about the new book, EpiGenetics, and pretty much Dr. Wallach's lifetime of achievement and research. Going to be very, very interesting. Michael Mueller is recording this for us tonight, so it should be a great show. So sit back, relax, and just absorb it all. So it's not what you hear, it's what you absorb. So.
Hey there. All right. I'm from New York, so I don't know anything about pigs, but I do know about the Razorbacks. Thank you for coming, everybody. I've never really emceed or done introductory kind of stuff before, but this is truly an honor for me. You know, maybe you guys heard this. I know there was a painting that was hanging in the Ritz-Carlton in Paris for many, many years until one day somebody realized it was a Charles Le Brun. Charles Le Brun was a famous painter from the 18th century, I believe, and they realized it was a multi-million-dollar painting, and nobody knew it was just hanging there. It was hanging there for decades, and nobody knew that there was a multi-million-dollar painting hanging on the wall. There's another funny story, but this is an example of how we miss the obvious. There's another funny story about a preacher who's talking to one of his parishioners, and the parishioner says to the preacher, "If you're stuck on a desert island, preacher, what book would you bring? What would be the one book that you would bring?" And so the preacher says, "Well, yeah, the Bible, of course. What would you bring?" And the parishioner says, "Well, I would bring a book on how to build a boat." We miss the obvious. We get stuck in our ideas and we miss the obvious. There's another famous story about a guy who's smuggling, and he crosses the border, and the border guard says he knows the guy's smuggling, and this is in the old days, and he's riding in on a donkey, and the border guard looks through the donkey and checks out the straw and goes through all the belongings and the baggage, and he can't find anything. And he lets the guy through. Next week, the guy comes by again, and he's bringing a donkey, and the border guard says, "I know he's smuggling something." And he goes through the donkey's pack and the straw, and he throws everything out, and he goes through, and he can't find anything. He lets the guy go through. He says, "Darn, I know the guy's smuggling something." Next week, he comes back again, and he goes through the straw, and he goes through the packs, the donkey's packings, and he can't find anything. Finally, he just freaks out. He just has to know what's going on. He follows the guy into the other country, and he finds out that the guy is smuggling donkeys. We miss the obvious. We have a medical model that is purportedly the greatest medical model in the history of mankind, and we're the sickest culture in the history of mankind at the same time. We have compounds that the body needs, that the body must have to function, and we have heart disease and diabetes and cancer and Alzheimer's disease, and we can't figure out that there's a relationship between the nutrients that we're missing and the diseases we have. And we go to the doctors, and we get our organs removed, we get cut up, and we get prescription drugs, and we get diagnoses, and we get tests, and we can't figure out that if you don't have the essential nutrients, you can't be healthy. We miss the obvious. One of the neatest things about Dr. Wallach's message, and what attracted me to Doc, was he's just a regular guy. He was raised on a farm. He noticed that they were feeding the animals nutritional supplements. They were giving the animals nutrients, but the people, his family, wasn't getting the nutrients that the animals were getting. Why would it be more important? Why would it be important to feed animals nutritional supplements, to give farm animals nutrients, and not the people who are taking care of the animals? Why would we care more about the animals than we care about the people who are raising the animals? We miss the obvious. The beautiful thing about Dr. Wallach's message, as entertaining as it is, and as informative as it is, and as inspiring as it is that when you hear it, you hit your hand on the side of your head like, oh my God, I could have had a V8, right? Oh my God, it's obvious. And on top of that, once you start to take these ideas incorporate these ideas into your life, once you start to incorporate these ideas into your day-to-day way of being, you start to feel better, you turn it around. Why? Because the body runs on these elements that we call the essential nutrients, like your car runs on gasoline. If you don't have any gasoline in your car and you take it to a mechanic, he could charge you all kinds of money. He could do all kinds of diagnostics. He could give you all kinds of special engine treatments. But if you don't have gasoline in the car, it isn't running. It's obvious. I encourage you all to listen to what Dr. Wallach has to say. You're going to be entertained. He's funny as heck. But more importantly, it's going to be life-transforming, especially if you're sick, especially if you're dealing with some kind of illness, especially if a doctor has told you that you're going to be on this medication for the rest of your life and there's nothing you can do about it. When you hear Dr. Wallach speak, you're going to say, like I said when I first heard him speak, it's obvious. So would you please join me in welcoming a good friend, a colleague, truly an inspiration, my nutritional mentor, and somebody who's just a great honor and a privilege to say that he is my friend, Dr. Joel Wallach. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank each and every one of you for being here on a Friday evening. You could be out partying. Appreciate you being here. And for those of you who don't know me, just very quickly, the thing that makes my view different, and Ben touched on it, is that I have a degree in agriculture. And in agriculture, we don't have health insurance for animals. And we need to maximize our income from raising animals. And so we had to learn how to maximize their lifespan, maximize their production of meat and milk and eggs from the same amount of feed. We had to have perfect pregnancies, no early births where they needed 3 months in the incubator. We had to have no birth defects, and the animals who were born on the farm had to reach either reproductive age or market weight without need for health care. We did that with vitamins and minerals. Went on to veterinary school, became a veterinarian. Halfway through veterinary school, I graduated ag school, so I was a graduate student, began to take pathology courses, wrote the first paper on a mass die-off in America from pollution. I'm sure it happened many times before, but nobody recognized it. Got it published, and that kind of redirected my whole life. Graduated veterinary school, taught pathology up at Iowa State University for a year, and then got invited by Marlon Perkins from the old Mutual Omaha Wild Kingdom show, and I'd worked for him through high school, to go to Africa and work on the White Rhino Conservation Project and the Elephant Conservation Project. Caught 200 white rhinos, shipped them back to the States, and if you go and you see a white rhino in a wild animal park or a zoo, it's probably one that I caught, or maybe even offsprings of the ones that I caught. After 2 years of working on those projects, Perkins sent me a letter, said, look, I've got a big grant from the National Institutes of Health. We need to study the causes of death in zoo animals and the people who live in close proximity to the zoo animals because they have the same air, the same water, the same food sources. We want to find out if pollution or nutrition have something to do with their causes of death. Came back, worked on that project for 10 years, and the short version is I did over 20,000 autopsies and 10 million chemistries on 17,000 some change of over 454 species of zoo animals and 3,000 humans. And the bottom line of the study was that every animal, every human being who dies of what we would call natural causes, not trauma, but natural causes, died of a nutritional deficiency disease and not pollution. Now, the book that came out of that, 1,200 pages, in the Smithsonian Institute, is a national treasure, and I'm just a young kid, and I was really very proud of that. And they moved me around from zoo to zoo, university to university, so I could deal with more species of animals and different people eating different things from all over the place. And again, to make a long story short, in 1977, I was working at Emory University in the Yerkes Primate Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and discovered the first documented case of a non-human with cystic fibrosis. I'm sure people had seen it before, but they didn't recognize it. But because of my vast experience when it came to autopsies, I recognized this immediately as cystic fibrosis, got it confirmed by the experts. And then when I told them it wasn't genetically transmitted, that I could create as many baby monkeys as they wanted with cystic fibrosis, because it was a deficiency of a single mineral selenium during pregnancy or shortly after pregnancy, and I could produce as many monkeys as they wanted, they fired me. They said, Wallach, you must be sniffing glue. Everybody knows that cystic fibrosis is genetically transmitted, and there's no way it could be something you could prevent, reverse, and create. And so, to make a long story short, again, went back to school, became a naturopathic physician, began treating humans in 1978, and been doing it ever since. It's 36 years. I've been treating humans with nutrition and doing the thing with nutrition as we did in animals. So what you're going to get is a view from agriculture, veterinary medicine, as a comparative pathologist, and as a primary care physician. So you're going to get 4 different views of the same subject. So bear with me and hold your questions until later. Now, in the beginning, doctors thought that all diseases were caused by evil spirits or little gods sitting on planets. And if you burned enough goats to the evil spirits, they would spare you of disease. And if you burned enough goats to the good spirits, they would protect you. That lasted for thousands and thousands of years. I don't know if any of you ever heard of the paintings in the Lascaux caves in France. And these paintings are dated to 28,000 to 32,000 years ago. And people who are very, very religious say, no, wait a minute, Wallach, the earth is only 5,000 years old. Now, I live in hotel rooms, and I've read the Old Testament and the New Testament literally dozens of times over the 36 years I've been on the road. And I can tell you there's no place in there that says the earth is only 5,000 years old. So I don't care if it's 5,000 years old, 32,000 years old. God made it, and that's all that makes me happy, right? And so I don't have a hoo-ah. But in these paintings, and you have to appreciate that those paintings lasted 28,000 to 32,000 years. How often do you have to paint your house? Once every 5 years. So they knew something about pigments. Very interesting stuff. And they were painted by shamans and medicine men and medicine women. And basically, they told health stories and disease stories. And then formal religions came along, and formal religions and science conflicted with each other. One of my favorite stories, of course, is Galileo. And he wasn't the only one, but he was one of the more vocal ones, and he wrote scientific papers on the fact that the Earth and the other planets circled around the sun. Prior to that, the churches all believed that the sun rotated around the Earth. And the Inquisition Committee from the Catholic Church at the time condemned Galileo to death for being sacrilegious and going against the Church's teachings and belief. And fortunately for him, a cardinal, there was a cardinal when he was a young man, became pope at the time and was able to commute his death sentence from being burned at the stake to house arrest for the rest of his life. And so that's kind of how there was a conflict between churches and science at that time. Hundreds of years ago, back several thousand years ago, physicians and philosophers believed that there was a cure-all. We only had to look for it. There'd be one treatment that would cure everything. It was called the panacea. That's where the word panacea came from. And if you could learn how to transmute lead into gold, you were smart enough to figure out that one cure for everything. It was called alchemy, sorcerers, okay? And even Disney came out with a movie, The Sorcerer. And after a while, the doctors just got into trying to turn lead into gold for the gold, not for the panacea. Now, Louis Pasteur came along in the 1800s, and he came up with the germ theory. He was a microbiologist, and he was a chemist for the wine industry. To prevent wine from becoming vinegar, he came up with the idea of heating it to knock down the population of yeast and bacteria to stop the fermentation process, the same way with milk, and it was named pasteurization after himself. Now again, he came up with the germ theory, And in the germ theory, he said there are certain bacteria, because they had just had a microscope invented by a Dutch eyeglasses maker, von Leeuwenhoek, and he could actually see bacteria, and he could grow bacteria from people who had pneumonia and meningitis and many other diseases, and then he could take those bacteria and inject it back into other people and to animals and get the same disease. And doctors fought him over that, tooth and nail. They would fight him over that. And so he had to set up an experiment right in the center of Paris. He got two groups of 25 sheep each group, and he gave one group a vaccination, which he created against anthrax, which is a disease that killed people and animals. And the other group got a dummy vaccination. It was just water being injected instead of the vaccination. Both groups he injected with heavy doses of the bacteria that caused anthrax, Bacillus anthracis. And in the group that was vaccinated, only 1 out of the 25 died. In the group that was not vaccinated, all 25 died. And the reporters were there. Thousands of people were watching this as it went along. And so he became very famous over the anthrax thing. He was also the guy, even though he didn't know the term viruses, he was the one to first come up with a post-exposure vaccine for rabies as a virus thing, and he figured out how to do that. Very, very smart guy. Took a long time for doctors to agree that, yes, there were germs. And once they figured out where there was germs, they said, you know, everything is caused by germs, even cancer and insanity and so forth. And a guy by the name of Koch came along and said, no, you have to isolate the bug, make sure that it's the bug, inject it back into a susceptible host, cause the disease again, isolate it again, get the same bug, then you know it caused the disease. The guy's name was Koch, K-O-C-H. About the same time, there was a priest in Austria by the name of Gregor Mendel. And he was a very smart guy, and he had taken many courses in what we would call today calculus, and he could predict numbers and things. And because he was very smart and a detailed kind of guy, the cardinal in the parish that he was the priest in made him put him in charge of creating peas for priests to eat during the wintertime. And he had hothouses where they grow these peas during the wintertime. And there were peas with red flowers, and there were peas with white flowers. And every once in a while, there would be one volunteer, or a dozen of them volunteer on the path between the two different hothouses. And these were ones that weren't planted. They would just pop up, and they had pink flowers. And he reasoned that they were a mix or a hybrid between the red flower and the white flower pea plants. And he could do experiments with crossbreeding and so forth. And he came up with hybrids. He came up with dominants and recessives. And so he's kind of the father of genetics. But he never related the genetic concept to diseases, just life itself. At the same time, Charles Darwin came along, and Charles Darwin did not know about Gregor Mendel, but Gregor Mendel did know about Darwin. Darwin was the son of a very wealthy Englishman. They were landed. They had 10,000-acre estates, and his mother was very wealthy. She was from the Wedgwood family, the English dishware company, and very interesting stuff. And he collected bugs and feathers and eggshells, and he would shoot birds and little animals and make collections. And when he was 22 years old, he wrote a paper for the newspaper of the Royal Society. It was very prestigious for anybody, let alone a 22-year-old guy to write the paper. And he wrote the paper on invertebrates. Little polyps would make sponges and reefs. And he was hired by the British Navy when he was 22 years old to go around the Earth in the HMS Beagle, a British warship, and build artificial reefs. And he was so successful at this, they hired him for another 3 years. So for a total of 5 years, Darwin was going to places that nobody else had ever been before and building these reefs. But he was also collecting animals that nobody had seen before. And he recognized immediately, well, not immediately, he recognized in 5 years when he wrote his book on the origin of species that parents of the babies were passing on information. Human beings had babies who were human beings. Dogs had babies who were dogs, puppies. Cattle had babies who were calves. Oak trees had babies that were oak trees. And he'd find these weird animals, and he would shoot them and bring them back and taxidermy them, because nobody would believe there were such things as penguins living in the Antarctic and so forth. So this is what he did, and his book was on the origin of species. And Darwin never said that man came from apes, but he said all things, all living things, whether you're a tree or a tulip or a oak tree or a human being or a hummingbird, passed on information to the young. Well, to sell newspapers, the reporters said that he said that men came from apes, and that wasn't what he said. He said all things pass on information, is all he said.